We are rolling.
I am Chris.
I am Ben. Welcome to a special road trip edition of the Popstorian podcast. I am live from the road this week. Chris, where are you live from?
I am sitting in my living room playing with my young daughter. So if you hear some baby noises as well, she's just contributing. Like that.
The Popstorian podcast with Chris and Ben.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
Greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market.
A date which will live in infamy.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
What are you supposed to do when you see the flash? Duck and cover.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Might have gotten away with it, too. If it wasn't for these blasted kids and their dog.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The evil of the thriller.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
Great power comes great responsibility.
Welcome to our second episode of the Popstorian podcast. This week we have another edition of our series, Westerns by the Decade, where we pick a Western from a decade of the 20th century. I guess we're going all the way to the 21st century eventually.
I would like to. I think that'd be awesome.
And this week we have the 1910s. So we're doing a film from 1916 starring William S. Hart for you. And then, what else do we have this week, Chris? Any other features? Second episode, so it could be our second anniversary episode edition thing.
Second anniversary edition thing? Okay. I'll roll with it. That's me rolling with it. Like, complete confusion and then acceptance.
Complete confusion and road noise.
Yeah, that's our episode this week.
Westerns by the Decade.
Let's start with a bit of context. In terms of, well, first of all, let's talk about what film we're getting into here. It's called Hell's Hinges. It came out in 1916. It stars William S. Hart, produced by legendary silent era film producer Thomas Ince.
I'm sorry, how did you pronounce his name? Because I've been reading up on him and I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
I've always pronounced it Ince.
Ince?
Like inch, but with a soft s instead of
Okay.
inch.
I didn't know I was maybe inch or ink or something like that.
There might be an alternative pronunciation, but that's the one that I'm familiar with, and I'm sticking with it.
Okay, let's roll with it then.
So this movie comes after last week. Last week we talked about the 1903 early Western blockbuster, The Great Train Robbery, by Thomas Edison and Co.
This one is kind of coming a little bit later in film history, where production companies have actually really taken off.
Yeah, by this time it's kind of a booming industry.
Yeah. So Thomas Ince, he produced what's called the Triangle Film Company, and it was like, is this before or after he kind of teams up with Griffith, E.W. Griffith?
I believe this would have been before.
This is before he does, because he is a really big name in the industry.
Pretty much the biggest name at the time as far as producers go. His company that he was affiliated with at the time, Triangle Distribution, was pretty much a massive distribution force. They owned several of their own theaters and had a massive network as far as getting films out there. So he was definitely a pioneer in terms of getting the film industry to be the business that we know it as today.
How about you tell us a little bit what Hell's Hinges is about?
How about you tell us a little bit what Hell's Hinges is about? I think you've watched it more recently than me.
It's about a young man and his sister who are actually traveling west. This young man is a minister who is traveling west for his new church, his new ministry, and he apparently he wants a city gig, but his bishops kind of know he's got a wandering eye, so they send him out west.
As one does.
Yeah.
This is kind of an aside off that point, but I just read Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash, History of Class in America, and there's very much this idea that was prevalent in America's history that I didn't know about, that, I guess I kind of knew about it, but I never heard it stated quite so clearly, that the people who were considered kind of lower class or not desirable people of lower income and people of other races were often sent into the frontier to just kind of get rid of them, pretty much, and to use as cannon fodder for the wealth-making experiments of the well-off in the New World. So going back to England, colonial times, they would just send the poor and the destitute of London, just throw them on boats and send them across the sea because they didn't care what happened to them.
Huh.
So it's interesting to see that kind of reflected in the plot of this movie.
Basically, we don't want you, so here's go on the Oregon Trail.
Right, exactly.
So this young man is joined by his sister, who apparently is a beauty to behold, and they travel west to start this new church. And they end up in a town called Hell's Hinges, which...
a very rowdy place, to be sure.
Yeah. So there's this one character, and I forget his name. He's kind of a black hat, mustache twirling kind of villain. And he recruits William S. Hart's character. Apparently the two of them really don't get along, but they have a common enemy against this one pastor because they figure if church is going to come to this town, then their careers as saloon owners and rowdy cowboys are going to be over. So they plan to kick him out, basically. And so William S. Hart, who is this very stoic, good with the gun, cowboy, your classic Western hero, or slash villain, comes out and he's going to scare them off. But when he sees the pastor's younger sister, who is quite beautiful, he has a change of heart and lets him stay. And apparently they have a romance that even seems to change Hart's character, where he, in one scene, it's actually a very famous scene where he's smoking and drinking while reading the Bible, trying to figure out what's going on with his life and this woman that he loves. And then, plot twist, the pastor is seduced by of course, the lady of the night at the saloon, but at the behest of our mustache twirler. And he is seduced and drunk, and he dies, and I'm not exactly sure there is of a broken heart or what happens exactly, but he turns into this drunk, and then at the end of the film he does die. Spoiler alert. And
we should probably include that up front. There will be spoilers for the movie Hell's Hinges in this podcast.
And it gets to the point where they burn the church down. Actually, the pastor, who's now a drunk, burns his church down. And Hart's character, who's away when this is going down, hears about it, races back to the town, and realizes that They put his Lady Love in danger. They burned down this church, destroyed everything they worked for. And he gets angry and goes and burns down the saloon, threatens to kill a lot of people. It's one of the greater moments of the film, the moment of truth here. And then at the very end of the film, him and his Lady Love take off together and, of course, head further west.
Head off into the sunset, so to speak.
Well, literally, as far as film goes, they're traveling into the sunset, I think.
An early example of that trope in the cinema.
Yeah, this film has a lot of those kind of things. So you're riding off the sunset, moving further west. But it also is that civilization meets the frontier.
Yeah.
And kind of that conflict between the two.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here in terms of stuff that's going on cinematically and historically and whatnot. It's a very interesting film, very popular, very well reviewed at the time, a great success. I think on a lot of levels. Definitely one that you should watch if you've never watched it, and if you're not a big fan of silent films, I think this is one that you could start with. It's not too terribly long. It is a feature. It's about an hour, and it's available pretty widely through legal sources. So,
well, it's public domain.
Yeah,
so you probably catch it on YouTube and not be a sin.
Definitely worth your time. The climactic sequence in particular is fascinating to me. It uses a process of color tinting, which I guess had already been used quite a bit by this time. Méliès was using it about a decade before this, but it's used to great effect here, the color tinting process. Basically, you have a black and white image that's been tainted. They taint it red to kind of indicate the heat of the flames, and it also works quite well as an emotional counterpoint to how the hero is feeling. It really emphasizes that feeling in the cinematography and the way that it's shot. And it's shot quite well. It's not one of those films that early cinema, there was a tendency to just stick the camera on a tripod and roll a big wide shot that showed the whole room, and basically you're looking at a stage play, but it's been recorded on film. This film uses a lot of cinematic techniques, close-ups and cutting, and all the major techniques that we rely on today to tell stories at the movies. To tell its story, it's very very sophisticated.
Yeah, but when you think about it, at this point, it's been 13 years since Great Train Robbery, and a lot of these techniques have been used many times over that, of course, the period of time. So we talked about earlier, the production companies already come into effect.
Yeah. So it's grown up into a whole industry, and now you have these excellent artists here creating this film. It deals with some pretty heavy and fascinating subject matter.
And there's a lot of symbolism in this film. Like even the Lady of the Night that I mentioned, she wears a snake necklace. And of course, you see a lot of religious symbolism in the film. But of course, the snake representing the devil or sin and things like that. So there is a lot of symbolism and a lot of storytelling techniques in this film that are, as you said, very sophisticated.
Yeah. Now, would you say that this film is pro-religion in its perspective?
Yeah. In a certain respect, I don't think it's not anti-religion by any stretch. It's almost like, it is saying that religion is key to civilization, and that's kind of one of the main themes in the film is that civilization is coming to the West and coming to the frontier, and religion is a major part of civilizing the West.
Yeah.
So it's not anti-religion, because the bad guys are all anti-religion. So, and then the main character almost turns to religion. I don't think we actually have an actual come to Jesus moment in the film for our main character, but he definitely reads the Bible. He goes to church. Falls in love with the preacher's sister. So it's not anti-religion at all.
Yeah, but it does have some pretty strong shades of gray kind of elements to it, where Hart's character kind of takes matters into his own hands and takes on the sort of revenge drama that becomes a trope. It kind of reminds me in some ways of a much later film, Unforgiven, in that respect, where there's kind of he's trying to do the honorable thing, but it's sort of an honorable revenge story.
Trying to reform his ways, but then you can only take so much. And I think that actually plays into another Western trope of the main character being both good and a little bad too.
Yeah.
Like, he's not afraid to take the law into his own hands. You see that in a lot of films. From going back to the Virginian, we talked about Owen Wister's Virginian, and all the way to John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, and even going into the 21st century remake of the Western.
Yeah.
So,
key theme there. It reminds me of some of Zane Grey's characters from around the same time period.
Yeah.
Some of his characters in like the Lone Star Ranger, Riders of the Purple Sage, are either outlaws or good men who got in over their heads into something bad. So there's oftentimes this kind of trope of how do you face down evil in a area where law and order is being challenged frequently, where there's not an established civilization around you to protect you. It's kind of one man against the elements, and one man forcing to make his own moral conclusions.
Yeah.
Very interesting theme. And then, of course, we have this religious figure who's portrayed as kind of a hypocrite and a drunkard.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about him is that he's never actually shown as a true believer or as a true religious figure. He's always looked at it at the side. He's in the opening scene where he's preaching at his church. You can see he's trying to catch the eye of the ladies there.
Sure.
Kind of gives them a wink, and he's looking for the glory that he can get in the ministry. And then, of course, that all leads into him falling to drunkenness and other temptations. Keep this G-rated.
There's a lot of films that are, in terms of like Christian film, that vilify, the atheist college professor, or the Christian. On the other side of the aisle, the Hollywood films that demonize the Christian preacher as always bigoted and homophobic.
Mm-hmm.
When the reality is that there's plenty of people who wear the cloth who aren't truly religious or truly good people, who aren't true believers, like you said. And but on the flip side, there's a lot of people who, wear the clothes of academia or science, who are true believers. So it's not as black and white as people like to make it in stories. There's a lot of shades of gray and a lot of room for individuals. Human beings are very much individual, and I think it's good for this film that they actually kind of portray the characters as individuals. They're not perfect. The good guys aren't perfect, and the bad guys aren't, totally unsympathetic. Although I think you could make a case for the saloon owner as being somewhat unsympathetic. But
I think the saloon owner guy, that mustache twirler, yeah, he's definitely on the bad guy aisle.
Yeah, true. But there are shades of gray to these characters. They're not just like, oh, the good preacher or the evil preacher.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Especially when you get the William S. Hart's character. The only exceptions to that would be, of course, the mustache twirling saloon owner and the preacher's sister. Preacher's sister is looked at very much as kind of this angelic character.
Yeah.
Which actually is a pretty common theme in this time period for films, from what I've been reading.
Uh-huh.
You look at D.W. Griffith's films. He particularly liked virginal young ladies and kind of this angelic figures in his films. So that seems like a common theme in this time period of films.
Yeah, it's very interesting the way that kind of evolved into the 1920s. You start to see more of the sort of independent, badass female heroines of the movie serials.
Which makes sense because of the culture in the 20s would be, of course, the flapper culture. And
yeah, as culture started to shift towards that the more flapper mentality, you had a difference in the way that women were depicted. And I think also as Hollywood grew and women became more involved in terms of telling stories, they had the opportunity to portray themselves without the interference of, or sometimes with the cooperation of men, so that they could depict themselves more the way that they wanted to be seen.
Yeah.
Not just some man sitting in an office making up desirable young versions without any rough edges or anything.
Yeah. So is this a good time to transition to what's going on in the culture?
I think this is the perfect time to do that.
So I wanted to start off with this little quote here from the movie. It's called "Oily Craftiness of a Mexican," which is describing the mustache twirling saloon owner guy, and that they're definitely derogative towards Mexicans, by the way. But interesting enough, what's going on in the United States at this time as well? There's a lot of trouble on the border between the U.S. and Mexico. It's actually called some called it the Border War, 1910 and 1919, and of course that's kind of in line with the Mexican Revolution. And Pancho Villa, very famous figure, actually crosses the border into the United States and raids some border towns in Texas. So that's going on as well. So in this film, you do hear some slander against Mexican people, and that's one of the reasons that's happening there. But this is also the height of the progressive era, politically speaking. So you're going to see a lot of laws passed. Actually, we talked a little bit in the previous episode about the Gilded Age going into the progressive era, and they're trying to fix the woes of the world. So at this point, it's called the Progressive Era. President William Howard Taft starts it off. He's president from 1908 to 1912, and Woodrow Wilson will finish up the decade 1912 to 1920, Wilson being one of those major progressive presidents.
Huge in terms of progressive movements.
So 1913 to 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. The idea being that the country is becoming more democratic, so people are gaining their more political power. The 1913 Federal Reserve Act happens. The Clayton Antitrust Act is revised from the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. So busting up the trust. The Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, I have to mention that because it's the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which limits how many hours children can work.
Yeah.
The Adamson Act, which limits the railroad workers' workday to 8 hours. The 18th Amendment is passed in 1919, which of course a few years after our film was made. But that starts the age of prohibition.
Yes.
And the 19th Amendment, of course, giving the vote to women, was passed in 1919. So a lot of changes are happening here. The idea these are changes that would progress the country and help with some of the woes there with the working class and with women and voting and things like that. At this time, a little over 92 million residents of the United States, 21% increase from the 1900 to 1910. And there are 46 states in the Union, one more from the previous decade. And you want to guess what state entered the Union in this decade? Or actually before, this is in 1907, so this is after our last film was made. You know what state that was?
I actually do not know.
It is Oklahoma.
Welcome to the Union, Oklahoma.
In 1907, they are the 46th state in the Union. According to U.S. News, an average car in 1915 was $2,005. That would be equivalent, and this you have to take these equivalents of modern day pricing a little bit with a grain of salt, because I found quite a few calculators online, and they all had different answers for me. So this is the one I stuck with. $2,005 in 2018 money is $49,205.28.
Gotcha.
And of course, the most popular car in the U.S. from 1908 to 1925 is the Model T.
Yeah.
It starts off at $850.
So the Model T was pretty influential in the creation of the 8-hour workday too, wasn't it? Wasn't that a big push of Henry Ford's?
I confess I have not read up on Ford or Edison like I kind of wanted to from the last episode. But Ford is famous for working on the assembly line because of the Model T. And so when you have assembly lines, you get shift work, which of course would move into shift time limits.
Totally different perspective on work.
Yeah.
Which is something that Karl Marx kind of predicted. He was a big fan of automation because he felt like it would reduce the number of hours that people would have to work, and therefore people would be happier and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think communism would be growing at this time, wouldn't it? Just worldwide?
In the 19-teens?
Yeah, sort of around that time.
It is. World War I, of course, is the major event in that decade, and the Russian Revolution happens right in the middle of that. So the Russian Revolution will happen in 1917, is that right?
Yeah.
And the U.S. will enter the war in 1917. So definitely Marxist and communist ideology is well established by this point.
A big year for Karl Marx.
Who had been dead for quite a few years by that point.
Yes. A big year for Karl Marx's ideas. Is what I meant.
We were talking a little bit last time about the Philippine War.
Yes.
In 1916, the year this film was made, the U.S. Congress accepts the Jones Act, which gives the Philippines their independence. So they do gain their independence in 1916. Chicago Cubs play their first game at Weigman Park. It's now known as Wrigley Field. And they beat the Cincinnati Reds. Sorry if there's any Red fans. Also, the PGA, of course, Pro Golf Association, founded in 1916.
Oh, wow.
Daylight savings time is put into action by the first country in the world. Do you know what country that might be?
I believe it's England, but I could be wrong.
Actually, Germany.
Germany invents it.
And this is, interestingly enough, during the First World War, too. So Germany ratifies that, and England and France will soon follow.
I would think it would be very difficult to change how you measure time in the middle of a war.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
But leave it
that
to the
would be incredibly awkward. Can you imagine, like, what if they didn't get the memo and they're trying to attack at this time and they're an hour late? I don't know. I have a hard time getting to church during daylight savings time. So Jeanette Rankin, and this is March, so this is, of course, Women's History Month. Jeanette Rankin is the first elected congresswoman to represent the state of Montana, and first congresswoman in the United States history, as far as I know. Anyway. Boy Scouts come into play, and you have to remember this is, of course, the progressive era, so a woman going to Congress, Boy Scouts of America, designed to kind of help young boys. Going into some film history, Mary Pickford.
Yes, indeed.
Which we have not talked about on the show, but Mary Pickford will become the first female film star to get $1 million contract.
Yes, indeed.
D.W. Griffith will release his second most famous film, Intolerance. And Charlie Chaplin will be signed to a film contract by Mutual.
Yes.
So, there's another little piece of film history, or film trivia, I guess. In 1916, there were 4 shark attacks off the Jersey Shore, which would
I remember reading about those.
Later influence another major film.
Yes, they would. Let me guess. What film would that be? Would that be the 1966 Batman?
You got it.
There's a famous
if there's
shark
anyone
scene in
listening
that,
to
right?
our program who actually knows the answer to this question, feel free to contact us.
Send us an email if you know the name of the film that Chris is referring to. It's not the 1966 Batman. What's our email address, Chris?
It is popstorian@gmail.com.
That is correct. And if you send us the correct answer, you will win $0 in cash prizes. So email
but a lot
first.
of cool points.
Very good. So quite a lot happening. You have Intolerance coming out that year, of course, which is a massive epic. Kind of 3 stories in one rolled into a big, very lengthy motion picture.
It was the
Of
longest.
course, the follow-up to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, a film
definitely
that
is
was
okay.
very notorious.
Intolerance becomes like the longest film, right? Up to that
I
point.
believe to that time, but there might have been a film in Germany that was longer, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't have the exact run times in front of me. Certainly a massive epic, very much in terms of size and scope. Massive sets, the ancient Babylonian temple constructed on the Hollywood backlot. So it's kind of a period piece rolled into a modern day piece. Basically, Griffith was offended that he got a lot of accusations for being a racist based on his racist film, The Birth of a Nation. And he felt like the progressives needed to be a little bit more tolerant of his position. So he made a film about intolerance throughout history. Kind of intertwines these different stories about intolerant people from his point of view. It's very interesting, a very personal and kind of niche political view. I think even then, his views were considered extreme by most of the mainstream. Even then,
I confess I've never actually watched a D.W. Griffith film, not even Birth of a Nation. So, also, before I forget, the third portion of our show, the homework or challenge portion.
Ah, yes.
Has any of this kind of made you want to look into anything about westerns at the time, or the time period, or is there something that jumped out at you about challenging us?
In my reading in preparation for this, I learned that William S. Hart's stardom was kind of eclipsed by subsequent Western star named Tom Mix, who had more of an action-oriented kind of style. William S. Hart was more, a little bit more cerebral, I guess. A little bit more thoughtful and slow-moving and more given to epics, whereas Tom Mix was very action and adventure and stunts and that sort of Western.
I'm glad you came back to that, because that's an important point to make. Because Tom Mix is kind of the start of these, is you kind of more action flick, but more kiddie movies, more like kid-like movies.
Yeah.
That's why I think William S. Hart's films kind of stand up better than maybe Tom Mix does, because his acting is very much what you would see later on in like John Wayne, the more serious John Wayne movies, and Clint Eastwood movies. The stoic figure.
Mm-hmm. Very much a part of that legacy. And I think initially there's this kind of concern that movies are morally ambiguous, because you would often see Nickelodeons in the same sort of places that you might be able to watch ordinary films there, but you also might be able to get access to pornography and other sort of seedier places might have Nickelodeons too.
Yeah.
But I think there was some misunderstanding from people who were concerned about the morality of movies in general because of that. But later on, by this time, movie exhibition is kind of more available to a more family-friendly audience. And so you start to see more movies that are marketed to a younger audience, like Tom Mix's movies were.
Right.
He becomes kind of a hero to kids of the era. And of course, he precursors the Lone Ranger and Hopalong Cassidy and all these other Western heroes.
Right.
They're very sort of upstanding action heroes of the West.
Yeah.
Less moral ambiguity and a more kid-friendly. I don't know if watered down is the right term, but a sort of sanitized version of the West.
Yeah. I would agree with that. Do you think because there's this kind of ambiguity of Nickelodeons, whether they are actually pornographic in nature or just kind of entertainment, is that why Hell's Hinges actually has a lot of moral themes?
I think it's rooted in that, but I think it's also rooted in the kind of identity of the nation at the time, because things are very much shifting. The Industrial Revolution is here to stay at this point, and science and reason are very much key underpinnings. You have the Scopes monkey trials a little later on.
Only a few years down the road.
So Darwinism is becoming more popular in America, and people are starting to ask more questions about their faith and the American identity of faith, which has always been part of America's culture. America was never either godless or puritanical. Kind of depends on where you were and who you talked to.
Right.
Which side of the aisle you fell on. But I think as a national identity, there was a lot of questions about morality and faith, all that stuff. And this film tapped into that and asks those questions, and I think challenges the audience to investigate for themselves and answer for themselves into those questions.
That is interesting take on it.
It's an interesting time.
It is. It is.
Well, sir, I believe that's a conclusion to our episode on Hell's Hinges, part of our Westerns by the Decade series.
It is. What are we going to do for our film next time?
Next up, let me try that again. Next up, we have a film from the 1920s. I believe we talked about doing The Covered Wagon.
The Covered Wagon.
That was what we talked about previously.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
If that changes, we'll send out an announcement through. You can follow us on Twitter at Popstorian.
Popstorian. We also have a Facebook page called Popstorian. It's kind of original like that.
Popstorian.com is the website.
And our email is popstorian@gmail.com.
Yes, you can find new episodes. We'll share them on social media, and they'll be on our website at popstorian.com. And you can send us emails complaining about our need to do shows on the road. We won't, we can't do anything about it now, but you can still complain and we'll listen to you. You can send us suggestions for stuff you want us to talk about on the show. If you have thoughts, comments you want to share with us, we'd be happy to read them out on the air, time permitting. And we'd love to have you as part of our listening community.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Popstorian podcast. Be sure to subscribe. You can find us online at popstorian.com or on Facebook and Twitter. Tune in next time for more of the history of popular culture.
I think that was fun.
I think that's good. Yeah, that was, we didn't hem and haw and beat around the bush nearly as much as we did last time.
Yeah. Maybe we should just put you on the road more often.